First of all, I just want to welcome you all to York and of course to the Environment Department and really congratulate everyone on a fantastic project. So all the team who've made it happen, but of course all of you fantastic volunteers. It's a project that I've followed and admired ever since I sort of first heard about it. And it's really great to see how much has been achieved, and I'm sure it won't be the end of it. It will continue from here on. But I was asked to talk about some of the research that I'm doing, so I had a few different options. So I won't talk about which way I voted, but you can probably guess, being an academic. But actually, it's been a fantastic thing for my career because it's fascinating to see how it's playing out, and it's provided a lot of opportunities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And of course, it actually started before this, but who could forget the flotilla on the Thames when Nigel Farage and Sir Bob Geldof traded insults across the water. And being from Australia, as you can probably tell, I know my own media had a field day with this, the battle on the Thames. So of course, when the vote went the way it did, a lot of people, certain politicians, but obviously a lot of people in the fishing industry were quite happy about it because it was something that they had campaigned for some time. And a lot of this was to do with dissatisfaction with the common fisheries policy. So this common fisheries policy, as the name suggests, is common to all of the European member states. It doesn't manage all of our fisheries, but it does manage a lot of them, and it manages the most important ones, the things that people sort of hear about, mackerel and cod and haddock, and those sorts of species. It's fair to say, though, that it does have a history of failure, both in terms of biological and economic sustainability. It's been going since, depending on where you sort of start the clock, since 1983 officially. And it was criticised by pretty much everyone who had anything to do with it for many years, myself included. If you do a Google search, you can probably find quotes from me slagging off the common fisheries policy. However, things are changing, so we won't be bound by this after Brexit, assuming it still goes ahead, and even that seems to be up in the air at the moment. But chances are it will go ahead, and we won't be bound by the common fisheries policy. So we'll be delivering something new. The slightly ironic thing is the common fisheries policy was actually just coming good. So after several decades of not working very well, it's actually through a series of reforms. The first one actually in 2002, but particularly in 2013. It was really actually becoming a model of good fisheries management. And these things are starting to produce the goods. So one of the big issues is shown by this graph here. So this shows how close the quotas, the amount of catch that people are allowed to take every year, matches the scientific advice. So back in the early 2000s, the average was that the quota was actually set 35% above what the scientists were telling them to do. So this is a bit like spending your money faster than you're earning it. You pretty much soon run out of money, and that is exactly what was happening. So this was not sustainable. But what we see over that couple of decades is actually a much improved situation, and now the quotas are set much more closely to the scientific advice. And as a result, this map's a little bit hard to see, but basically what we've got is the UK up the top there. And if the pie chart is red, that's clearly bad. If it's green, it's good, and if it's yellow, it's sort of in the middle. And what you see is down in the Mediterranean, the status of fish stocks is terrible, basically. It's not in a good way. But up in the waters around the UK, it's much improved. So we're at a situation now where we have sort of roughly about 30 to 35% of our fish stocks are overfished. Now, you should think none of them should be overfished. Well, they shouldn't. But that is actually much, much better than it was even sort of 5 or 10 years ago. We also have a target through the European Commission to have all stocks at sustainable levels by 2020. That's a legally binding target. we're actually not going to reach it, so I don't know what happens then. That's one for the lawyers, but we are heading in the right direction. Another big issue is discard, so throwing away of fish. So probably a few people have heard of Hugh's fish fight. I can see a lot of nods. So this is a pretty crazy situation that arose because of the way the regulations played out. And in some cases, the figure that lots of people heard was 50% of the catch was being thrown away. If you actually look at it in terms of numbers of fish, it was sometimes up to 80 or 90% of fish. So a lot of those were very small, so they didn't make up much of the weight. But of course, those small fish never got a chance to grow up. They never got a chance to breed. And so it really was a tragedy. This is a difficult thing to fix, but again, it's going in the right direction. And this is all through the efforts of the European Union. And of course, the UK feeding into that. And they've been a very significant player. Another thing that was completely forgotten during the Brexit campaign was we have the most profitable fishery in the whole of Europe as well. So despite sort of, all this talk about how terrible things were, actually on average, and the average is a key point here, the British boats are doing very well. So of course, once Brexit actually was decided on by the voters, lots of other messages started to come out. Some of them we'd heard during the campaigns, but some of them we had not. So Michael Gove continues to say it will be a sea of opportunity, and some members of the fishing community continue to post that message. But we have the seafood processing industry, so the ones who actually market the fish and sell the fish, and that business is worth actually significantly more than the people who catch the fish. So it employs something like almost 15,000 people. It has a turnover about 3 billion. The catching sector is only about 1 billion. So it's actually a really important industry, and they are terrified of Brexit on the whole because of the effects of being able to get supplies, because most of what actually British people eat is imported, and most of what we catch is exported, but also they rely on labour from the EU as well. So many places, sort of 30 to 40% of the workforce is from other European countries. And this was not even mentioned during the campaign. Of course, there's also concerns about how it might affect the environment. This was mentioned. I was part of the sort of team of scientists who was trying to bring the issue up the agenda, but it wasn't really listened to very much. And this is not necessarily going to be bad, but the point is we don't know, because European legislation has been important. It has been very important for a lot of environmental protection over the last few decades. And even the fishermen now are starting to worry about what might actually happen. It's dawned on a lot of people that it's actually a lot more complicated than we first thought. And you can't just claim back all our waters and kick everyone else out, because for a start there'll be a few political issues, but also who will buy all the fish that we catch, because most British people don't want to eat it. So there's a few issues to sort out. The government has a vision of how it's going to be. We love visions. This is a 2020 vision, you'd almost say. It sounds pretty good. We're going to have a mutually beneficial deal with Europe. Well, we can see how that's going at the moment. We're going to have sustainable and profitable seafood sector, a cleaner, healthier and more productive marine environment. It sounds great, but how do we get there? And that's the real challenge. So one of the things that I've been involved in over the last couple of years is working on this and trying to figure out how we're going to get there. And of course, the best thing to do is to get everyone's views and to ask them. And so through a series of workshops, we assembled key people from different sectors. So we had NGOs, we had scientists, we had people from young seafood, we had fishermen, we had politicians, we had all sorts of people in the same room actually about a year ago. And we surveyed them and we gathered their views from different sources, and they gave presentations, etc. We had a follow-up event in London, and we put all of that together to try and get a picture of, first of all, what people's priorities were, and then secondly, how we might reach them. So this is a very large and complicated table that I won't ask you to digest, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. So the first thing is, most encouragingly, is that all these different sectors, commercial fishermen, processors, inshore managers, recreational scientists, NGOs, etc., they all want sustainable fisheries. So this was good to see. And this was coming from both what they'd said to us, but also in their official stances. They also want well-enforced management with strong governance. So they all recognise the importance of that. So that's very encouraging. The fishing industry themselves, not surprisingly, their sort of key priority is to be allowed to catch more fish. So they want more quota, they want full control of European waters, and they want a better deal for the inshore fisheries as well. Whereas if we look at, for example, the seafood processors and suppliers, and indeed the fishermen to a large degree, one of their main priorities is access to zero or low tariff market, so to be able to both import and export fish. They know how important that is, but of course this is a difficult balancing act, because if we obviously are trying to have our cake and eat it. So what's the way forward? Well, again, as an Aussie, I like to quote this. European fisheries management is probably the most complicated in the world. The reason is because you have so many countries in close proximity to each other. And so the fish don't care where these borders are. They'll swim between everything. You know, they might be born in France and grow up off the coast of, Norfolk and then migrate north to Scotland or wherever it is and then back to Holland. That's actually quite normal for a lot of species. You have to manage collaboratively. Many of the key species that we fish for, they are using these shared waters, and therefore you have to manage them in that way as well. There are some other species which don't move so much, and you would think it would be less complicated. And some of these are very important to the UK. So, for example, scallops are the most valuable fishery in England and the third most in the UK as well. And we actually already largely have control of those fisheries. But of course, a few people might have seen this in the news over the last few weeks. So this should be one of the easiest situations to sort out, but it's clearly not. So that particular stock is one of over 100 fish or shellfish stocks that we share with Europe. And so if you think about all the fuss that went on over that one little situation, we've got to sort that out 100 times, at least. The UK could potentially just go, no, that's it. Legally they could say, we're going to claim exclusive rights on our 200-mile zone. No one else is allowed to fish in that area. And it is true that things are a bit unbalanced at the moment. So a lot of what is caught in those UK waters is caught by non-UK boats, by other European boats. Possibly as much as 58%, so, more than half. But this has been going on for a long time. This is a picture of the Dutch fleet being guarded against the British, just like it was in the Scallop Wars the other week, but this is 300 years ago. So it's been going on. We also fish in European waters, not quite to the same extent, but because so much of what the British catch is sold in Europe, a lot of it is landed there as well. So again, that could be disrupted if relations break down. And so as I said, the EU is by far the biggest market for British caught seafood. So we've got to balance these two different things against each other. One of the really big arguments is about how much quota that the UK has. So at the moment it's according to these set percentages that were decided back in the 80s. So what a lot of people are pushing for is this thing called zonal attachment. So you work out where the fish live, and then you decide what percentage should go to what country on that basis. So I'll show you, I'll explain this a bit more in a second. But what's complicated is that fish move around, again, as I said, and so how do you work this out? For example, you can work out where they are as adults, but if there's a different place when they're spawning or when they're young, then that gets complicated. So it needs a lot of science. I mean, I would say this is a scientist, but, it is true, I think. But we've done some of it. And so this is an example. This is cod in the North Sea. So this map basically shows where there's red, there's a lot of cod. This is based on surveys over many years. And you can see the British waters here. And so you can work out what's in what area. And then you can say, okay, well, on this basis, we should have this much quota. This much should go to Norway, Denmark, etc., etc. And we've done the same thing. We did this with a number of places and species. This one's anglerfish or monkfish. And again, you can see how the distribution is very patchy. And that, again, is challenging. So how does this patchy distribution match to what quota actually the UK gets at the moment? So again, just a couple of examples. But one of the really interesting things from this research, we looked at 10 species, was that in a lot of cases it's the same. So the orange bar here is how much is in UK waters, and then the red bar is how much quota we get. So you can see it's very close here. It's close for a number of these other species, and the same down here, but there are some big exceptions. So here with hake, there's a lot more in British waters than actually we have quota for. And the same with anglerfish. And there are a number of other examples like this as well. My sort of suggestion, I'm actually meeting with DEFRA in a week or two to put this forward to them, is that the UK needs to be strategic. Not just try and claim everything back, but actually say, well, look, hake in the North Sea is really important to us. Because if we don't have enough hake quota, once we've used that up, we have to stop fishing altogether, because now you're not allowed to throw fish away if you don't have a quota for it. So this is what's called a choke species, and that could cause big problems for the industry. So let's try and get some more quota for that. But for these other ones, oh well, maybe we could ask for a few more percentage of haddock, but we'll let that one slide. You know, a bit of give and take really is what's needed. So this is another opportunity that Brexit provides. And this is actually not to change how things are done with Europe, but to change how things are done within the UK. So one of the big issues for me and many people is that most of the quota goes to the large boats. So 77% of boats in England, fishing boats, are less than 10 metres long. They get about 3 or 4% of the quota. So this one boat, the Cornelius Verruc, that has 1/4 of all the quota for all fish in England. Now most of that is mackerel, so it's a little bit distorted. But the other interesting thing is, as you might have guessed by the name, that's a Dutch-owned boat that has bought British quota. So it gets complicated. There's rules around that, but it's not very clear. So we really need to do a lot more to support these smaller operators, because they are much more sustainable, but possibly even more importantly, they give a lot more back to the local community. They provide more jobs. Many of them have been fishermen in these areas for potentially hundreds of years. And so, you know, if we lose those, we lose all that history and culture as well. And so I think, you know, really what we need to do is address that situation, is to fix our own backyard as well. And there's lots of different ways we can do this, but many of them would be beneficial. Just to sort of emphasise this point, and this is some more work that we did, and this is about the sustainability or the reduced environmental impact of this smaller boat sector. So what we have over here is the way that the different types of boats catch fish. So the key point here is the dark bars are these small boats. And so if there's more of this dark in the bar, that means that's the main method they use. So for bass, for example, they mostly use fixed nets or drift nets and hooks and line. They don't use the trawls, which can have bycatch, even dolphins and things like that. The same over here for sole. Beam trawls, which can cause a lot of disturbance and damage to the seabed, are entirely used by larger vessels. So the small boats are just using these much lower impact gears. So this is another reason to support these smaller boats. Unfortunately, the management of these small boats and the inshore fisheries has been neglected. So this is a graph of different species around England, in this case, and they were assessed according to the Marine Stewardship Council criteria. So Marine Stewardship Council is an eco-label, if people are not familiar, and it assesses how sustainable fisheries are against some quite strict criteria. Most of these are red, which means they wouldn't pass, but the reason is not necessarily that they're bad, it's because we don't have information on them, and we haven't put the effort into managing those areas very well. So again, this is another area that Brexit is providing an opportunity to change the way we do things. We could have done this all along, but since we are shaking stuff up, let's fix this up as well. This is probably a bit more sort of relevant to the type of work that you guys have been doing, but this is the importance of looking after the wider marine ecosystem, because that's what everything else depends on. It's what fisheries depend on. It's what the tourism industry depends on, but of course oceans go much further than that. They moderate our climate, they produce oxygen, they protect the coasts. I could go on and on. They're absolutely vital for human well-being. Again, the protection and improvement of the health of the marine ecosystem has largely been driven by European legislation over the last few decades. I don't think many people, even the Brexiteers, wouldn't argue with that. A lot of it is down to these EU directives. And in fact, in terms of marine protected areas, most of the ones designated by England, or indeed Scotland, actually don't do very much. They look good on the map, but they're what called paper parks. So they don't actually have any management, or many of them are open to scallop dredging, for example. Well, if you're not protecting against scallop dredging, what are you protecting against? You know, nothing, basically. The European marine protected areas, or the special areas of conservation, on the other hand, they are much more stringent, because if you don't look after those, some nasty NGO like the Marine Conservation Society tries to take you to the European Court, and that's the government, that is, and so they fix that up. And so actually a lot of the real progress in protection of Britain's seas has come again because of this European legislation. And it's been much more effective so far than the national legislation. So we really need to make sure this continues after Brexit, that this excellent protection is not only maintained, but hopefully expanded. So I had to put this in today because one of my other big areas of work is on marine protected areas, and particularly on the Isle of Arran in Scotland. And the Lamlash Bay no-take zone, fully protected marine reserve, the only one in Scotland, one of only 3 in the whole UK. It's tiny, but it's something. It's celebrating its 10th birthday as of Thursday, and today they're having a big celebration day as well that I couldn't be at, but I'm here instead to celebrate it. And it's a fantastic success story. And again, one of the real features of this is that they've worked with the community. So the community has been very involved, both in the campaign for protection, but also to keep it going. And in fact, in this case, what started off as a 2.5 kilometre squared little protected area is now 280 kilometres squared right around the south of the Isle of Arran. So it just goes to show what you can do with people power. So just to finish off, so is Brexit a sea of opportunity or a sea of risk? Well, I'm trying to make it a sea of opportunity as best I can, and with help from my colleagues. It does provide an opportunity, if we get it right, to actually improve things, for sustainability to really take centre stage, for us to try and become a model of best practice right around the world. But it won't be easy. We need to maintain, if not improve, relations with our European neighbours, both because of sustainability but also for a good economic sense as well, to maintain favourable trade in seafood. Brexit also provides, as I said, an opportunity to fix up some of the issues within the country, and particularly to support this small-scale fleet and ensure that it becomes more sustainable and more profitable. So that first graph I showed you with saying, or that point I said about the UK fleet being very profitable, that's not these guys. That's the big boats fishing for mackerel and haddock and things like this. The small boats are really struggling, and that really needs to be sorted. And then finally, of course, we need to look after the marine environment, because everything else flows from that. And so we need to improve, not weaken, environmental protection. So that's all. Lots of people, even more than this, have helped me with this work. And of course, again, a big thank you to everyone who has given me their views, who came to our workshops and answered our questionnaires, and all of that. And thank you for listening.